Okay, hello and a good day, everybody, and good, I believe it's morning in the United States, depending where you are. Today I'm speaking to a very interesting guest. It's Ken Braun. He works for the Capital Research Center. It's a think tank, and they also have an organization called Influence Watch that is looking at organizations and money in public policy. And he wrote a very interesting article on the, forget the number right now, it's $2.3 billion per year. That's what, 9 zeros. Just to get that right, $1 billion per year goes into anti-nuclear activities. So, Ken, welcome to this channel.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, I want to, can you maybe sort of run us through it first, or maybe the Capital Research Foundation, and what made you interested in this topic of NGOs influencing public policy?
Well, so the general subject of NGOs and nonprofits influencing public policy is what our influencewatch.org website is about. It's kind of a Wikipedia page that covers the influence of not just NGOs, but politicians, unions, political organizations, and the like over public policy. But the nonprofit sector is enormous in the United States, and so Influence Watch covers more of those than anything else. And I have blessed, a little bit fortunate that my employer lets me have a wide range of interests and to explore, and energy in particular, and nuclear energy specifically as it applies to climate policy and a lot of other things is something I've been looking at for a couple of years now. And I decided to go through the most recent budgets available of all of these NGOs that have in some fashion expressed an anti-nuclear position or advocated against, the keeping plants open. And I added them all up, and their annual revenue is currently around, conservatively speaking, 2.3 billion. I did $1 billion a year. And we can get into the methodology if you want, but I used very conservative estimates and left out a lot of stuff that I probably could have left in. And I haven't really dug into all of the organizations available. So I think 2.3 billion is a bottom line figure, but it's one I'll stand behind.
Well, I mean, I looked at the price of advanced reactors to finish one of them is about $2.4 billion.
Sure. Yeah.
So it just seems to be that seems to be a more sensible way of allocating money. But I want to ask you the nature of these organizations, because I looked through the list. There's some obvious culprits here, like the Sierra Club. Things
Mm-hmm.
that I don't think it will shock any of us. But there were other ones that seemed a little bit more benign, things involving breast cancer, if I remember
Mm-hmm.
correctly, things of that sort. Maybe run us through who are the type of organizations, and why do you say all of them have some nuclear position?
So there is, in most of the cases, I have a recent kind of joint letter to Congress, advocacy letters that they've sent to the U.S. government, U.S. Congress, promoting anti-nuclear positions. One letter was 600 co-signers, another one was more than 700 co-signers, another one more than 100. So a lot of these came directly from that. They specifically, in all three of those cases, I believe, called nuclear energy dirty energy that shouldn't be considered part of any so-called green energy programs. So most of them came from that. Some of them, like the Sierra Club, has a very strident anti-nuclear position on their website. They're kind of the old guard of the anti-nuclear movement. They've been against it for all of my life, all of your lifetime as well, probably. And in some cases, these are groups that have I found evidence of them advocating for closure of in either coast. Recently, we had a threatened closure of the Diablo Canyon plant in California, and did close the Indian Point plant in New York, just up the river from New York City. So those are the kinds of things that I found. I kept it very, like I said, very strict. If I couldn't find a specific position within the last 10 years, I didn't use the group, even though I think there's some that I might have been able to include if I wanted to go a little bit outside of that. And yeah, there are some groups in there that are very strange, have very, you'd be surprised that they have anti-nuclear positions, because their mission doesn't seem to have anything to do with energy or anything of that sort. The League of Women Voters, very well respected in a lot of quarters organization here in the United States, point something billion or million, not not 9 zeros, 6 zeros, $1 million budget. Um, they've had an anti-nuclear position in their policy book for years, and you can find evidence of them opposing nuclear energy at the local level with some of their groups. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, $100 million+ organization, has a very specific anti-nuclear position on their website. The Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, a kind of recent upswing group that is now on the downswing. They ballooned up to over $70 million, and now they're back down under 10 million. Also,
That's the one who's found us still some of the money, right?
yeah, they've had some issues. Besides their foolish position on nuclear energy, they've had some other
But
unpleasantries.
I would understand the US law here because it seems
Mhm,
to me that a lot of these things are it's like an obvious grift. Put it this
mhm.
way,
Yeah.
there's just a lot of money flushing. Unfortunately, it's the case in South Africa as well. We're not better at this. You start an NGO, you put a nice cause, and it seems just money throws into your way, and all you have to do is complain and activate and change policy, right? And is there any what are the laws and the oversights regarding this type of stuff? I mean, do we know where the money comes from at least?
Sometimes you know where the money comes from. And I've like if it's a public foundation that's giving to the public foundation, then you can track the money. And I did. It isn't in the report that you're seeing, but it's now on our Influence Watch page for opposition to nuclear energy. The biggest donors to these groups are Bloomberg Philanthropies, biggest donors over the last 3 years since 2020. The biggest known public donors are Bloomberg Philanthropy, 80 million plus a year. A gentleman named Fred Standback, who we can get into, another 80 million. MacArthur Foundation, very old, long-standing, prominent American foundation. Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, 45 million. He's the founder of Intel. A group called the Arabella Advisors, more than 29 million. So there's some, you can track the money that way. But I mean, if Ken Braun, private citizen, wanted to, without having a private foundation of my own, put $100 billion into one of these groups, and they don't report it, they don't have to report it. The IRS would know about it, but the public wouldn't. And there's, probably some examples of those going in there, because in most of the cases of these groups that I tracked, they are what we call a 501c3 by our tax code educational foundation. They're supposed to be a public charity that is enhancing public knowledge and discourse.
Right.
As I think we both agree, and the science backs us up, the things that they're saying about nuclear energy are making people measurably less intelligent. But they under our tax code, they're protected and able to do that. And as a
Right.
private citizen, I can anonymously give to them.
And right, and I know, we go into free speech laws and private protection laws and things of
Mhm.
that when we ask, where every dollar comes from. So I understand that there is a threshold for disclosure and things in many countries, but just the amount of money going to this makes me very skeptical. And then another point I would like you to elaborate on what you wrote is they seem to be funding universities as well. There's just one university in Maryland, if I'm not mistaken, that's just like pumping out lots of anti-nuclear publications and stuff of this sort.
So I don't know that in that particular instance that the University of Maryland is pumping out anti-nuclear publications. An anti-nuclear group, the World Resources Institute, gave money to the University of Maryland for a kind of vague purpose. I haven't really looked into the money flowing to universities and how much anti-nuclear money is going there. There's some, I'm sure. I can't give you a figure right now. As I said, my $2.3 billion estimate is just these nonprofits and just a subset of some of these nonprofits. So it's a pretty safe number. But
Well, we have the weird thing in South Africa, so where I come from. We have we have a thing called the CSIR, this Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, right?
Mhm.
We're supposed to have a mission to assist industry. So you've got a variety of interests, and they're basically scientists, like university without a campus type of thing, a research hub, if you will. And then we have the University of Cape Town and Johannesburg. Johannesburg's a little bit 50-50 on this, but Cape Town. Now, Cape Town is where nuclear power comes from. But if you look at the fundings for the engineering departments and the departments on new energy experts, they come from Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, German think tanks in particular, and they put out enormously strong anti-nuclear sentiment, where our own Council for Scientific Industrial Research says there's no future for nuclear in South Africa in all the scenarios they ran. All the
Hmm.
predictions to the year 21. I mean, really? Like,
Yeah,
that's the type of thing. And then you look at the money, and I've been trying to track it. It's the same story, but it flows from think tanks to NGOs to think tanks to the universities.
yeah, and just as an aside, it's rather striking that Germany is. I mean, I've read about a time when Germany was rather good with physicists who understood these things, and now they've become a nation that is, I mean, obviously you're in Paris, the shining star of nuclear development on the whole
Well,
world,
yeah.
and Germany. I is it jealousy? I don't know. What is the problem there?
Well, the thing that happened in France, it was almost dropped the ball here. When François Hollande was president a few years ago, the Greenpeace advised him to get rid of again Greenpeace NGOs, right?
Yeah,
To sort of
they're
commit
on
to
my list.
40% nuclear, just
Uh-huh.
phase it out, right? And he made a pledge, but it was a symbolic thing because he was going to win the election on his marginal vote. And then EDF fired the engineers. And when they had to rebuild, France lost the expertise, and that's why Flamanville and the HPC is so expensive. So
Mhm.
even the damage in France, the French just realized it a little bit early and they retrained the engineers, but it costs money. So, and this is
Mhm.
the type of tactics. And I would assume in the US they're doing the exact same thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, as far as the knowledge base, I mean, we just opened a reactor in Georgia, added to a plant. That's the first one in decades that's been opened up, or one of the first ones in decades. I mean, our program's been frozen for since the 1970s, effectively. And yeah, you lose the knowledge base, not just at the high end of the designers, but the workers that build the plants and whatnot. One of the favored tactics to say we shouldn't open these things is to say, well, they're just too expensive. Well, yes, it's because each one's a work of art and designed brand new, as if we just discovered there's no even modest effort to get an economy of scale going again that
Yeah.
we should do. I mean, these things have been around for 70 years, right? Um,
Well,
this
the way you have to build it to get economies scale, you need to build at least three of them.
mhm,
Okay. And in the US, we build one every decade. You're basically starting at the top of the S curve every
right.
time. And $10,000 a kilowatt hour is the top of the S curve. That's Vogtle, that's Hinkley Point.
Mhm,
Where you look at the Chinese, the Indians, and the Russians and the South Koreans, they're building at a constant rate every 5 years.
mhm.
So, this is part of the grift that goes on, is that they block the next phase of development, and then they say, "Oh, look, you guys can't get a project done." Well, what do you expect?
Yeah, and I think we may have some disagreement here. I don't really know what your position is on this, but I would put the obsession with subsidizing weather dependent power systems like wind and solar as
Yeah,
part of the grift, because almost all of these groups that are on my list, it may be 100% of them, are their opposition to nuclear goes hand in hand with their support for hundreds of millions. Even we've got an estimate we may spend upwards of $1 trillion on our recently passed green energy project, the Inflation Reduction Act, we call it here. Um, if you're going to throw that, I mean, my personal opinion, getting outside of my employers, just
right.
study the money flows. My personal opinion is I don't think any form of energy should get $1 trillion in subsidies from the American taxpayer. This, however, is a democratic. We arrive at consensus opinions, and I'd rather end an argument, a bad argument, rather than win it. And so, if we're going to spend $1 trillion, it should be spent on something that's going to be around in 100 years and having a
Yeah.
capacity factor of 95, whatever nuclear is, rather than windmills and solar panels that'll end up in a landfill in 30 years and it's time to build new ones that never really were kicking out power when you needed it. They're kicking it out when the sun's shining, the wind's blowing.
And 30 years is optimistic. I mean,
Mhm.
so far it's 20 years and batteries go for 10 years. And, you're going to rebuild your infrastructure for 10 years. That looks like an ultimate grift to me.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and that's part of this process. I mean, as I say, we're seeing in South Africa as well, where Our government is now, they used to have 9.6 gigawatt earmarked for nuclear, which is not a lot because we need electricity. They've now reduced that to 2.5. The government said, okay, fine, you guys can have that fat in the system if you want. We just want 2.5. They still don't even allow that.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's like they never satisfied with this whole thing. And if every time, as you say, when you look behind it, you've got the NGO funding the wind and solar. And my argument with the wind and solar has just been, I'm not opposed to it where it works, but to tell me you can run modern society on that, and especially we being a mining and a automotive and a heavy industry based country, I mean, it's just fantasy stuff, right? And this is exactly what they want. So at the same time, they're destroying the existing industry by pushing these things, and they're offshoring.
Yeah, and one thing I find just something claiming to be an environmental movement supports the industrial. I mean, I agree with you. There are places for rooftop solar where you can you've already compromised the land by putting a building there, then put something on it to collect some energy. It's basically a bonus there. But when you're looking at hundreds of times the land use versus a nuclear plant, or even worse when you compare it to natural gas, to collect the same amount of energy. I can remember when we had an environmental movement in this country that wanted to conserve the environment rather than pave it over with solar panels and wind turbines that will, as you say, end up in we now need to produce a landfill to put the garbage in after 30 years when they need to be taken down. I live near a pretty sizable wind facility, and when I fly home, I can out the correct window of the plane, I can see red lights flashing as far as the eye can see at night with these wind turbines, and they're very creepy too. They all flash in unison, so it's you know.
Yeah, I don't know how they've rationalized themselves into saving the environment in that way. In terms of these things, so this is sort of backtrack a bit and say, okay, we've got this $2.3 billion that goes to environmental groups that have some anti-nuclear statement. But what is the general public in the United States attitude towards nuclear? Like how much influence do these guys have? Because I would guess, like any lobby group, they sometimes win, they sometimes lose, right?
And so it's interesting you asked this, because just last week, the Pew Research Center, another nonprofit NGO, and a big one, did a poll. And so support for nuclear energy has gone overall since 2020, has moved upwards from 43% to 57%. Republicans 51 to 67, Democrats 37 to 50%, which sounds good. Sounds like we're moving in the right direction. The problem is you dig a little bit further into the poll, you find out that 66%, and larger portions of them being on the Democratic side of things, want to encourage wind and solar energy. Encourage presumably means throw tax dollars at it, versus 7% who think that that's an unpleasant idea. And then it's more mixed when you get to who wants to encourage nuclear. 41% want to encourage it. 22% want to actively discourage nuclear energy. So, even if you get to the break-even point of half of the country thinks that this isn't any longer a dangerous, scary energy source, which is what the propaganda has put forth, or a dirty energy source, which is what a lot of these NGOs are promoting, you still have the industrial wind solar grift going on that's going to crowd out the nuclear energy, because this fantasy that you're just getting free energy from the wind and sun, and a lack of understanding of the math that goes into
or just the physics that, I mean, we saw this in France where they pushed rooftop solar, they pushed it, and it forced the nuclear plants to load follow, which damages your machine basically, because it has to be on all the time.
Right.
They can, but it's not good for it. And now France, the government overreacted, in my view, a little bit, and they renationalized EDF, and they're probably going to buy out the wind and solar guys and just recommit to nuclear. Now, that's not the ideal solution either, because again, you're taking private investors' money away. But that is what they forced the government into, because you see, in France historically, the unions were all in favor of nuclear. It was a left-wing movement, It's the same in South Africa, actually.
Yeah.
The US, you've got cognitive dissonance about this story because nuclear historically was utilities in the United States. And, the Republicans tend to support it while the Democrats don't. Have you managed to explain that contradiction?
Actually, a great joke came from France. I think was a French teller of this line, and I forgot where I heard it. Was asked the question, why does the United States have this problem with nuclear energy producing it where the French don't? And he said, well, the problem is in the in the United States, you have one form of cheese, one type of cheese, and 300 different ways to build a nuclear reactor. In France, we have one way to build a nuclear reactor and 300 types of cheese.
Right.
Second most important part of the joke was, and in France, the communists are in favor of nuclear energy, and in the United States, as my $3.5 billion shows, they're generally the left is opposed to it. And I will note,
it's a very rich left. Usually it's not the communists that chase the wealth. They tend to like the spoils for themselves.
Yeah. And you mentioned, so at the top of my list is a lot of the conventional climate, environmental, and nonprofits. But if you get further down in the list, I mean, the League of Women Voters isn't considered a climate nonprofit. The NAACP isn't a climate nonprofit. They are left of center in both cases. So, I mean, there's a lot of names on this list that are only kind of allied involved in the climate movement. They're supposed to have other remits that they are working on, but they've
Have you checked how much money from the oil industry goes into this? Because I looked at this a few years ago, the history of the environmental movement, and since the very beginning, Rockefeller's always a name that can get you a bit discredited. But if you look at Maurice Strong, for example, who founded the Rio Earth Conference, they were all heavily oil tycoons that went into the environmental movement. And I don't know what the oil industry's tactic was at that time. Are they trying to buy the guys out, or are they trying to weaponize them? But it just seems that they were part of this nexus.
Yeah, it's a little trickier to find out when, for the reasons I said about the privacy of the money. When a corporation gives money, it isn't always easy to track that. There are examples of, like Rocky Mountain Institute, one of the 9-figure groups on my list. Shell Oil, they prominently put in their annual report that Shell Oil is, I can't remember, it was either $100,000 plus or $1 million plus or $500,000 plus donor. And they also had General Motors, Boeing, Alaska Airline. I mean, some folks that really look like they're buying indulgences to get out of
Right.
to buy off.
This is Amory Lovin's organization, yeah?
Exactly. Yes. Probably. I mean, patient zero in the anti-nuclear movement in the United States is Amory Lovins, and Rocky Mountain was his. He founded it. Yep. In fact, his recent writings were what I used to explain Rocky Mountain's position on the issue.
Yeah, that is an interesting fellow because, as far as I know, he doesn't have a physics or a engineering background, and he's a guru in energy efficiency and stuff, and promotes renewables, gets money from the oil industry, and is the anti-nuclear expert. What a surprise!
He's the anti-nuclear prophet, really, in this country. I mean, he said back in 1970 something, wrote an article for Foreign Policy, I believe, where he was asked about nuclear energy, and he said something to the effect of, it would just be a tragedy if we could come up with some super abundant, clean, limitless, source of energy because of the fear of what we might do with it, which, it's sort of how prosperous this world should stop right here and not get any bigger, any more prosperous, and it's just a fear of progress.
That's like the carpenter during the Industrial Revolution. So this cool stuff is just horrible. Let's leave it in the ground. It sounds like that type of thing.
Yep.
Yeah. So let me ask you then, this for solutions to this. What do you think the public should do, or how should we react to this type of grift? Because obviously it can't last forever.
Yeah. So I think I said a few moments ago, my goal in putting these items out is to hopefully end this argument one day rather than necessarily win it. I would like to hope one day soon, some of these nonprofits, one or more of them, abandons these positions and comes around. The Nature Conservancy, which purchases land for protection in the United States, and it's a nonprofit and a very big one, is pro-nuclear. They put out here's how we can't get here where we want to go with carbon reductions using weather dependent wind and solar sources. We should have, I think their desire is to make 33% of the world's electricity production come from nuclear, or maybe it's
Yeah.
30% of total energy. I mean, that's a positive position. If all of the 3.5 billion folks I have, or 2.5 billion, I'm where I was at with that. But anyway, if all of them, or at least half of them, the big ones, came around to that position, I personally might have some disagreements with their other policy positions, but everybody at that point wouldn't be Amory Lovins anymore. We would all be looking at a world that would have superabundant energy, and we'd spend the
But,
trillion
but
dollars
you
on
know,
that.
when I engage these guys privately, so obviously I haven't met Lovins, but I spoke to Mark Jacobson, for example, at
Mhm.
Stanford. I privately mentioned, and I said to him, "Look, Mark, I don't understand. Renewable's fine. It's, you can have your 70%. I want the 30%. That's basically what I said." And I said to them, it was on Twitter, and I said, "Look, why are you guys so anti-dogmatic?" And they showed me details about it being expensive, and then I showed them, but look at the rest of the world outside of America not being expensive, and they still haven't answered me. And then the answer is basically, yeah, but you cannot trust the books in China and Russia. And I said, okay, fine. Maybe they're not transparent, but are you telling me South Korea and India are not free and open societies? And they
Yeah.
seem to be building on time. So maybe they're just cheaper, and the US needs to learn how to build again. And so is France, where I'm working at the moment. So is South Africa, where we lost our technique. So it's not, the US is bad. It just happens to a country. But they can't come around to that position. But on a personal level, I find some of them actually relatively okay when you talk to them, at least. But then it comes to the public face, and it's sort of
and
like Che Guevara's.
and that's what if you're looking to get back to the question, where do we go with this? I hope that's where we go with it. I hope that I think there's a lot of these. There's enough money going into the wind and solar grift that some of that money is finding its way back into these nonprofits, and so these folks in some cases are having a hard time seeing their principles change through the dollar signs flowing in the door. That being said, public policy can change that. If that $400 million in energy subsidies and battery technology and everything that the Congress passed a couple years ago were to be redirected and say, no, what we're going to do is just to have a France in the 60s, 70s level,
70s, 80s, yeah.
yeah, nuclear building program, and that's how we're going to reduce our carbon emissions. And tell some of these nonprofits, hey, you can either come along with us and support this or not, but we're going to tell the American people. I mean, if you look on the U.S. Department of Energy website, it's very clear nuclear is safe. Nuclear has tiny land use footprint compared to, they say all of the facts that are there that these nonprofits ignore. And so,
Well, and just the ridiculous regulations. I mean, I said this on Robert Bryce's podcast. I'm not
mhm,
making excuses to respect public safety, but aircraft crashes is ridiculous, right?
mhm,
I've analyzed buildings against it. It's $500 million extra on top of a power station just for aircraft crash.
oh,
It's
wow.
ridiculous.
Wow.
Okay, so that's and then that is assuming it works properly, which it didn't at Vauxhall, because they built halfway through, they realized there was a requirement they had to change that exploded the cost. And then the other one is linear no threshold. I don't see how you can justify that thing, right? And
Mhm.
we cannot even have the debate. I mean, there's another debunked study that's now in the Guardian. I saw the other day doing its rounds, and I read it halfway through. Like, it's just nonsense that apparently all doses of radiation is dangerous. Give me a view, like if you can get a few of those rules just changed, the cost will come into proportion. And my suspicion is, based on calculations, they'll be as cheap as the Chinese,
Mm.
because I don't
Oh,
think the Chinese are doing it in practice. I think they know this.
right, and I mean the LNT standards. I would put those up. I was thinking about this last night. I mean, if I could come up with three lies that really screw up energy policy in the United States and carbon
Right.
policy, and what it would be the LNT standard. It would be the idea that the levelized cost of energy between the wind and solar things is equivalent to everything else, and the land use. The three L lies. Those would be it. And if you could just convince you know 80% of the American population to follow the facts on those three items, we'd change everything. So
I've got a question here for you. It's somebody asked, would laws block the revolving doors help, or would blocking laws, I suppose, help it? I mean, do we need more laws basically to stop this type of thing?
revolving doors from
Well,
what
I
revolving
suppose what
doors
he's
go.
asking is the money flowing to NGOs. Is this a legal process? They exploiting? Is they, but how would you? What legal would like? Do we need laws to fight this thing? I suppose is the question.
Um, so I have a coworker, and I kind of agree with his standard on this. And again, this is not an organizational position. This is Mike and I having this opinion. I would do away with the the nonprofit protection for educational nonprofits entirely.
Yeah.
If you wanna subsidize speech in this way, you shouldn't be. You should be able to do it, and you should be able to do it anonymously. I really don't have a problem with the anonymous speech. That has its place, but you shouldn't be able to do it with a tax exemption that kind of protects you from allows someone to it basically encourages that sort of speech or more of it. I would that's not a panacea, but I think it would help a little bit in reducing the amount of money flowing into these things.
Yeah. You see, so we have this big issue in the developing world where NGOs, because our economies are so small. So $1 million in America is maybe not a lot in the grand scheme of things, but in the South African economy, that can buy you a few politicians. And there you have this disproportionality where NGO with a catchphrase gets a lot of money from good-hearted Americans or Europeans, and then they turn into this type of monster. And then on top of that, you sometimes have the National Endowment for Democracy throwing cash at that,
Mm-hmm.
which ends up being money flowing back from the CIA. Now, I don't know if it's the intention of the CIA, because I think they don't have control of their budget sometimes, but it just seems to me that this is another demon that goes out of it.
So the World Resources Institute, which is like one of the top three on my list there, um, the basis I used for their anti-nuclear position was they gave an award to a couple of activists from South Africa who blocked what the award said was an effort to purchase reactors from Russia, and it implied that this may have been one of the biggest nuclear deals in the world if it had gone through. The American CIA might have jumped in there to make life rough on a Russian. I assume it's Rosatom in that instance. I don't know the facts, but I certainly wouldn't want to lay serious money that that's not what happened.
So
It's totally plausible to me.
it's a bit complicated because first we had this President Jacob Zuma who was corrupt as hell. I mean, he built a big palace for himself. So anything he did was suspicious, whether it was honest or not. But I spoke to the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa and I asked them what was this about, and they said, well, first of all, the trillion rands, which was double the price. That was what their estimates did. They sent out what was the RFI, request for information. And France, I know personally, wanted to tender on that. Now, was the deal promised to Russia putting in a president? Zuma was so corrupt, it wouldn't surprise me. So, even I believed it at the time. Is it an ideal opportunity for the US to step in and create propaganda? Yes. But nobody knew about these two ladies who did the protest. They got money from an organization called Earthlife Africa, who seemed to get money from the US, and there was a link to the National Endowment for Democracy. Again, these things are also, there's no evidence to really pinpoint at it, but it was just a dodgy thing. And also the government messed up the impact assessment, and they didn't follow the proper procedure. So they had a legitimate reason probably to oppose it, on those grounds. But it was still, there's a lot of mystery around what happened. I don't think we'll ever get to the truth of it.
Yeah, and I mean, getting even off the nuke, there's a group not on this list, but is also kind of noxious in how they behave internationally, called International Rivers. They're based in, I believe, Berkeley or Oakland, California, which is where a startling number of these groups have addresses. American Rivers blocked a major, or has tried to block a major hydro dam. I forget which African nation it was in, but one of maybe the Democratic Republic of the
Yeah,
Congo,
probably.
where 90+% of the people don't have any electricity at all functionally. and instead wanted to encourage them to build these wind and solar projects, and that's the energy that they should have, rather than, I would rather build nuclear plants in place of hydro plants as well. Um, but that's a better reason to oppose a hydro dam if you've got a better idea, not if you've got a worse
Well,
one.
well, I mean, if you have the Zambezi River and you build a dam there, just the flow would probably create a dam the size of the Hoover Dam, equivalent to that. So,
Yeah.
it seems like a sensible investment from my perspective.
It's yeah. I don't. There are some fantastic vistas in the United States that have been flooded in the effort to, for good reason. At the time, there was no other option for creating cheap electricity. In hindsight, we probably could have done that better if we'd waited a couple of decades for the nuclear power to come online. And yes, there are certainly instances where you're just getting a good. I'm not opposed to hydro dams. I just
Yeah,
don't.
no, I hear you.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I hear your position on that. I suppose just to sort of get to closing, because I think we've sort of covered the NGO industrial complex. It's basically a lot of money being thrown at people. We don't even know where the money comes from, where it goes, but it's influencing policy. Um,
Yeah,
is the yeah?
and in a lot of this, because one reason this $2.3 billion estimate is very conservative is because there's a lot of money flowing in between these groups, especially of the larger ones, that make it almost impossible to track where, where you see it moving, but you don't know where it started or where it ended.
Have you checked if they have any relationship to the anti-nuclear publications like Counterpunch and the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists and those type of things? Because I've got a suspicion that some of it goes there as well.
Yeah, I mean, you will occasionally see quotes in some of these groups from those organizations. I haven't counterpunch. I mean, I haven't. I like this. Is Counterpunch a nonprofit? I'm not sure. It's not very big.
Well,
So
it claims to be funded by users. What do you call it? Subscription based or something of that sort of
okay.
donations and things. That's what it claims. I haven't checked in its books, and it's
So in that case, it wouldn't the money flow wouldn't show up in what I was looking at. Like I said,
yeah.
that's on top of my 2.3 billion.
Well, the thing is, I've been picking fights with the writers on Twitter, and they quote all of the groups in your list, and this is part of the information feeding system. Is that you've got like this nexus, and the thing is that people need to realize it doesn't take a lot of money. You probably don't even need $2.3 billion. I mean, I won't be surprised if that money doesn't all go for anti-nuclear stuff. If only a fraction of it goes for it,
Oh,
but they
sure.
create information space, and then people just stop cross quoting them, and before you know it, the whole thing flows, right?
And there's this, so if you're a left of center American, you really put a lot of stock in what the Sierra Club, the NRDC, the Environmental Defense Fund, all these groups say. If you're a kind of centrist American, the League of Women Voters maybe, sounds like most people in the United States don't have an ideological hat that they would put on that group, even though it does have some very extreme positions like this. That, yeah, you end up, they put their finger on the scale and change policy in ways that on an issue like this that's really important, and you just don't think of them as being a player in that field, but they are.
Well, I think the answer to this, sort of the last point we'll get into, is you mentioned earlier, we need to get these groups to change their position. Now, myself as somebody, I tend to at least, I mean, I've changed my positions probably politically, but I've had Noam Chomsky on here, for example,
Mhm.
not that I engage all of his positions, but I actually, I'm a civil engineer. I tend to be more in a New Deal camp these days, and I would like to engage them. I mean, do you think there's an opportunity at least to get some of them to change their minds?
James Hansen,
Yeah.
it has been taking. I mean, he's been arrested for climate protests, and he's a pro-nuclear guy, and takes, from what I've read, some pretty serious criticism from some of the folks that support these nonprofits, some of these nonprofits, for saying the truth, that you can't get to where you want with carbon emission reductions with these, industrial scale wind and solar. James Hansen, I think, is an example of where you can go with this. get more like him, that would there's folks on the left who have sensible positions on that, and that is I think the point to emphasize to those that haven't changed their mind yet, that there's safe water over here. Come on in.
Yeah, the other person that I wouldn't quite regard is Steven Pinker at Harvard,
Mhm.
who's come out saying the fear is just irrational and that people need to really reevaluate it. But I haven't gotten, or I haven't reached him yet. But I would like him to look into LNT as an expert on fear, because I think
Sure.
that's in my view the root of all the fear, right?
I agree with you. I agree with you. If you're familiar with The Simpsons, the TV cartoon, I mean, this is
Yeah.
the longest running scripted television show in American history, and every episode begins with basically an anti-nuclear message. So it's how do you?
Right. Again, I would like to thank you for this. Just where can people follow you and the rest of your work? What can we look forward to on this topic?
Well, I'm going to do a couple more blogs on this. Like I said, the at influencewatch.org, you can find um, a page for opposition to nuclear energy. It lists all these groups. We have separate profiles for all of the groups that made up that $2.3 billion estimate. Um, you will find a lot of my work anonymously done there. My name's not on it. Capitalresearch.org is where my professional work shows up right now, with my name on it. I'm far more snarky on Twitter and Facebook to some degree, and you can find it there. And so Capital Research Center is on my profile, so look that up and follow me. And I'm not going to let this one go. I've been writing on this point for one employer or another since 2013. So
Wow,
I hope.
that's 10 years. So well. Anyways, thank you. I'd like to thank you for exposing this, and I think as somebody in the industry, I really appreciate it, because it's it might secure my future employment, so to say.
Well,
Yeah.
we need your employment secured for a good long time, and a lot more like you. So I'm
All
happy to
right.
do it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ken. I appreciate it, and everyone, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and please subscribe to Ken's work.